There are things a man writes down because numbers make sense when the world doesn't. Rainfall in inches. Fence posts replaced. Hay bales stacked and counted twice. I kept a ledger for everything, every nail, every dollar, every calf born, and everyone that didn't make it. But the day Ruth Calloway stepped off that stage wagon with a bruise the color of old thunder still fading beneath her left eye, I opened my ledger and couldn't find a column for what I was looking at. There's no heading for a woman who flinches when you reach for her hand. No tally mark for the way someone holds their own shoulders like they're bracing for a blow that hasn't landed yet. I was 34 years old, and I had measured everything in my life down to the quarter inch. But I had never once measured how long it takes a person to stop being afraid of you. That I was about to learn can't be measured at all. It doesn't come in inches or days or any unit a man can record. It comes in small, invisible things: a door left unlocked, a plate set without shaking hands, a single night where someone sleeps without waking up screaming. This is not a love story the way most people mean it. There was no sweeping declaration, no grand rescue. It was slower than that. Quieter, and it cost more than either of us expected. But if you've ever watched someone learn, one impossible morning at a time, that they're allowed to take up space in the world without apology, without punishment, without earning it, then you already know this kind of story. And you know that it doesn't end the way stories are supposed to. It just continues. The way a river continues. The way breath continues. Not because it's dramatic, but because stopping was never really an option. I'll tell you something about the spring of 1882 that nobody in Harlan County much remembers, because nobody thought it was worth remembering. The creek behind the Dawson property flooded 17 inches above its banks in April, drowned 4 calves that hadn't been moved in time, and left a watermark on the east wall of my barn that stayed there for 6 years like some kind of accusation. I wrote it all down. April 14th, 1882. Creek rose 17 inches. Lost 4 calves, 2 heifers, 2 bulls. Estimated loss, $42. That's the kind of man I was. AM, probably. The kind who needs to write things down to make them real. My name is Silas Drummond, and I've kept a leather-bound ledger every year since I was 19 years old, when my father died and left me 160 acres of New Mexico Territory scrubland that wasn't worth half what he'd paid for it. I started the ledger because I was scared. Because numbers don't argue with you. Because if you write down that the temperature dropped to 11 degrees on the morning of February 3rd, then it dropped to 11 degrees on the morning of February 3rd, and no amount of wishing or praying or pretending will make it anything else. I trusted my ledger more than I trusted most people, and in fairness, the ledger had never lied to me. The entry for June 9th, 1882 reads, Ruth Calloway arrived. Stage from Fort Sumner. Condition, thin, quiet, bruised. That was all I wrote that night. I sat at my kitchen table with the lamp burning low and the pen in my hand for 20 minutes, and those were the only words that came out. I remember the ink drying on the nib 3 times before I set the pen down and closed the book. I should back up. Pastor Whitfield came to see me in May, which was unusual because Pastor Whitfield generally avoided my property on account of the fact that I hadn't attended his church in 3 years, and had once told him, in front of the whole congregation, that his sermon on the book of Job was the worst piece of reasoning I'd ever heard from a man who wasn't actively drunk. We didn't have what you'd call a warm relationship. But he came anyway, riding that sway-backed mule of his up my drive with his hat pulled low against the wind, and he sat in my kitchen and drank my coffee and told me about a woman. Her name was Ruth Calloway, née Hargrove. She was 26 years old. She had been married for 4 years to a man named Dale Calloway in Las Cruces, and Dale Calloway had died in February when his horse threw him on a frozen trail, and his head struck a rock in exactly the wrong way. The town had buried him without much ceremony because Dale Calloway had not been a man who inspired ceremony. What Pastor Whitfield did not say directly, but what I understood from the way he held his coffee cup and looked at a spot on my wall about 2 feet to the left of my face, was that Dale Calloway had been a man who used his hands for things hands should not be used for. And that Ruth Calloway, now widowed, had no family, no money, no prospects, and nowhere in Las Cruces that would take her in because Dale's family blamed her for his death in the vague, irrational way that grieving people sometimes blame the nearest woman for everything. She needs a situation, Pastor Whitfield said. A situation, I repeated. A home, a position, something stable. You're talking about a marriage. He looked at me then. I'm talking about a woman who has nowhere to go, Silas. And I'm talking about a man who's been living alone on 160 acres for 6 years and hasn't spoken to another human being in. How long has it been? I spoke to Newcomb at the feed store on Tuesday. About what? Fence wire. The pastor set his cup down. You need someone as much as she does. I'm not going to dress it up. I didn't answer right away. I poured more coffee. I looked at the ledger sitting on the shelf above the stove, where I kept it when I wasn't writing in it, and I thought about what a second person in this house would even look like. The chair across from me had a saddle blanket draped over it. The second bedroom had become storage for tools and salt licks. The idea of someone else's breathing in these rooms felt as foreign as the idea of rain in July. What's wrong with her? I asked. Nothing is wrong with her. There's always something wrong with all of us. What's hers? Pastor Whitfield rubbed his jaw. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said very carefully, She is afraid of men, Silas. She is afraid of being in a room with a man. She is afraid of the sound of boots on a wooden floor. She is afraid of raised voices, and she is afraid of silence. She is afraid of being looked at, and she is afraid of not being noticed. She is, as far as I can tell, afraid of approximately everything that constitutes daily life. And she is trying very hard not to be, which somehow makes it worse. I stared at him. And you thought of me, I said. I thought of the quietest man in Harlan County who has never once raised his voice in the 6 years I've known him, and who keeps a ledger of everything because he needs the world to be orderly and predictable. Yes, I thought of you. I didn't say yes that day. I said I'd think about it. And I did think about it for 9 days, during which I repaired 14 feet of fence line, treated a heifer for hoof rot, and woke up at 3 in the morning 4 separate times to lie in the dark and wonder what I was doing with my life. On the 10th day, I rode into town and told Pastor Whitfield to make the arrangements. A wedding, if you could call it that, happened on June 8th in the back room of the Whitfield church with 2 witnesses, Mrs. Whitfield and old Tom Dawson, who owed me a favor and didn't ask questions. Ruth wore a gray dress that was too large for her. She was thin in a way that suggested not poverty, but something worse, the kind of thin that comes from not eating because eating requires being in a kitchen, and kitchens have knives, and knives mean something different when you've lived with a man like Dale Calloway. She didn't look at me during the ceremony, not once. She said "I do" to a spot on the floor about 3 feet in front of her shoes, and her voice was so quiet that Pastor Whitfield asked her to repeat it, and I wanted to tell him not to make her say it again, but she did, slightly louder, still aimed at the floor. I signed the certificate. She signed the certificate. Her handwriting was small and precise, and I noticed that her hand was steady, which surprised me. I'd expected trembling. But her hand was steady the way a person's hand is steady when they've made a decision, and they're going through with it regardless of what their body thinks about the matter. We rode back to the ranch in my wagon. It was 11 miles, and we didn't speak for 9 of them. I pointed out things as we passed them, the Dawson property line, the creek where the flooding had been, the ridge where the pinyon pines grew thick enough to block the wind, not because I thought she cared, but because I didn't know what else to do. She nodded at each thing I pointed to. Small, precise nods, like she was cataloging information she might need later. When we pulled up to the house, I set the brake and came around to help her down from the wagon. I held out my hand. She flinched. It wasn't a big flinch. It wasn't dramatic. It was a small tightening of the shoulders, a half-inch retreat of the chin, a momentary closing of the eyes. If I'd been a different man, I might not have noticed it. But I was Silas Drummond. And I noticed everything, because noticing everything was the only way I knew how to be alive. I lowered my hand, stepped back, gave her room. There's a step there, I said, pointing to the wagon step. It's solid. I replaced it last month. She climbed down herself. She was careful about it, deliberate. She kept one hand on the wagon rail, and she didn't look at me while she did it, and when her feet were on the ground, she stood very still for a moment, the way a deer stands still when it's deciding whether to run. The house is there, I said, which was an absurd thing to say because the house was obviously there. But I was discovering, minute by minute, that I had no idea how to talk to another human being in a situation that wasn't about fence wire or feed prices. I carried her bag inside, one bag, a canvas thing held together with leather straps, so light it might have been empty, and showed her the second bedroom, which I'd spent 3 days clearing out. New sheets on the bed, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, A small mirror I'd bought from Newcomb's store, still wrapped in paper. "This is yours," I said. "The door has a lock, the key's on the inside." She looked at the lock, then she looked at me. It was the first time she'd looked directly at me since the ceremony, and I saw her eyes clearly for the first time. They were brown, not warm brown, not soft brown, brown like river clay. Brown like something that had been under a lot of pressure for a long time, and had compressed into something dense and unreadable. "Thank you," she said. "There's water in the kitchen. I'll make supper in about an hour. You don't have to come out if you don't want to." She nodded that small, precise nod. I closed the door and heard, almost immediately, the sound of the lock turning. I went to the kitchen, sat down at the table, opened my ledger, wrote, "Ruth Calloway arrived, stage from Fort Sumner, condition thin, quiet, bruised." Then I sat there and listened to the silence of a house that now had 2 people in it, but somehow felt emptier than it ever had with one. The first week was an education in the things I didn't know about fear. I learned that Ruth woke up before dawn. I knew this because I woke up before dawn myself, always had since I was a boy, and on the second morning I came into the kitchen at 4:30 and found her already there, standing at the stove with a pot of coffee made and her back very straight, like a soldier waiting for inspection. She'd set 2 cups on the table. The cups were perfectly aligned, handles pointing the same direction. "Good morning," I said from the doorway, making sure I said it before I walked in so she'd know I was there. "Good morning," she said. She didn't turn around. I sat down. She poured coffee. Her hand was steady again. That same controlled steadiness that I was beginning to understand was not calm, but its opposite. It was the steadiness of someone who had trained themselves, through repetition and consequence, never to spill, never to drop, never to give anyone a reason. "You don't have to make coffee for me," I said. "I don't mind." "That's not what I said. I said you don't have to." She was quiet for a moment. Then she sat down across from me in the chair where the saddle blanket used to be, and she wrapped both hands around her cup and she said, "What would you like me to do?" "What do you mean?" "In the house, what are my duties?" The word duties landed on the table between us like something dropped from a height. I felt it hit. She felt it too, I think, because she looked down at her coffee immediately afterward. "You don't have duties," I said. "This is your home. You live here. Every house has work. Then do whatever work you want to do, or don't do any. I've been managing this place alone for 6 years. I'm not going to fall apart if somebody doesn't sweep." She didn't answer, but I saw something move behind her eyes, not understanding, not relief, something more like confusion. Like I'd given her a math problem with no solution and she was trying to work it out. I finished my coffee, washed my cup, and went out to check the stock. When I came back 3 hours later, the kitchen was scrubbed clean, the floors were swept, the windows had been washed, and she was on her knees in the second bedroom reorganizing the small shelf of books I'd put there, 5 novels from a box my mother left, books I'd never read, arranging them by size. I stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment. She was so focused on the task that she didn't hear me, and for a few seconds I saw her without the armor. Her shoulders were lower. Her hands moved with a different kind of steadiness, not controlled, but absorbed. She was touching the spines of the books the way you touch something you've missed. I stepped back before she noticed me. I went to the barn, I opened my ledger and wrote, "She likes books, find more." On the 4th day, I had a visitor, and that visitor changed things in ways I couldn't have predicted. His name was Cayeta. He was Mescalero Apache, about 50 years old, though I was never sure about his age because he had the kind of face that seemed to exist outside of time, weathered and still and watchful in a way that made age feel irrelevant. He lived about 7 miles southeast of my property with his wife, Ishke, and their grandson, a boy of about 12 whose Apache name I could never quite pronounce correctly, so Cayeta had told me to call him Little Hawk, which I suspected was a gentle joke at my expense. Cayeta and I had known each other for 4 years. He'd appeared on my property one autumn morning, leading a lame horse, and asked if I had a forge he could use. I did. He fixed the horse's shoe with a skill that made my own blacksmithing look like a child playing with rocks. Afterward, I offered him coffee. He accepted. We sat on the porch and didn't talk much, which suited both of us fine. Over the years, a relationship had developed, not friendship exactly, because neither of us would have used that word, but something like mutual respect reinforced by practical exchange. He brought me venison when his hunting was good. I let him use the forge whenever he needed it. Twice, he'd helped me round up cattle that had drifted through a broken fence line, and both times he'd done it with a quiet competence that made me feel like I was getting in the way of my own cattle. He was, in short, the only person in Harlan County whose company I genuinely preferred to solitude. And he arrived on the 4th day of Ruth's presence in my life, riding up the drive on his roan mare, as unannounced as always. I met him in the yard. We shook hands. "Heard you got married," he said. "Word travels." Newcomb told Mrs. Dawson. Mrs. Dawson told Ishke. Ishke told me. Took about 3 hours. "Impressive." "Ishke wants to know if your wife likes squash." "I don't know if my wife likes squash. I don't know what my wife likes. I've known her 4 days." Kayata looked at me with an expression that might have been amusement, though with Kayata it was always hard to tell. His face processed humor internally, like a stove processes wood. You could feel the heat, but you couldn't always see the flame. "You married a woman you've known 4 days, he said. "I married a woman I've known 1 day. I'd never met her before the ceremony." Kayata was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My grandmother once told me that a man who adopts a wounded horse must be more patient than a man who raises one from birth. The raised horse trusts you because it has never had a reason not to. The wounded horse has to unlearn its reasons." "Your grandmother sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was. She also said that most men don't have the patience for wounded horses and should stick to mules." I wasn't sure if that was a compliment or an insult, and from the look on Kayata's face, he wasn't going to clarify. Ruth appeared in the doorway of the house. She saw Kayata and stopped. I watched her hands go to her sides, fingers pressing flat against her skirt, a gesture I'd already learned to recognize as her way of steadying herself. "Ruth," I said, keeping my voice easy, "this is Kayata. He's a neighbor, a friend." Kayata took off his hat. It was a gesture I'd never seen him make before, and it struck me in that moment how deliberate it was, an act of respect performed with the seriousness of ceremony. He held the hat against his chest and inclined his head slightly. "Ma'am," he said. Ruth looked at him. Something in her face shifted, not relaxation, not trust, but a small recalibration, as if she were recategorizing the situation from threat to uncertain. "Hello," she said. "My wife Ishke sends squash. She has more than we can eat." "That's very kind." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a cloth bundle, 4 yellow squash, still warm from the sun. He held them out, not toward Ruth, but toward me, and I understood instantly that he was giving her the choice of whether to approach or not. I took the squash. "Thank you, tell Ishke we appreciate it. She says you should come to supper, both of you, whenever you're ready, no rush." After he left, I brought the squash inside and set them on the kitchen table. Ruth was standing by the window, watching Kayata ride away. "He seems kind," she said. "He is." Dale said. She stopped. I saw her jaw tighten, a muscle moving beneath the skin like something trying to escape. "Never mind. You can say it." Dale said the Apache were dangerous, that they'd kill you as soon as look at you. I set my hat on the hook by the door. Dale was wrong about a lot of things. She looked at me then, that dense clay-brown gaze. "Yes," she said, "he was." That was the most she'd ever said about Dale Calloway in 4 days, and I had the sense that it had cost her something to say it. Not because she was defending him, but because acknowledging that he'd been wrong meant acknowledging what he'd done, and that was a door she wasn't ready to open all the way. I didn't push. I washed the squash. I made dinner salt pork, beans, and roasted squash, and we ate at the kitchen table in near silence, and when she finished, she washed her plate and went to her room and locked the door, and I sat in the kitchen and opened my ledger and wrote. Ruth spoke about Dale, brief, painful, did not press. Kayata visited, she called him kind. On the 9th day, I made a mistake. I was repairing the south fence, which required a hammer, and I came into the house through the back door with the hammer still in my hand because I'd forgotten to leave it on the porch. I wasn't thinking about Ruth. I was thinking about the fence post that had rotted through at the base, and whether I had enough posts left in the barn or whether I'd need to cut more. Ruth was in the kitchen, kneading dough. She saw the hammer and she dropped. Not fell, dropped. Her knees buckled and she went down to the floor with her arms over her head, and she curled into something so small and tight that I couldn't believe a grown woman could occupy so little space. She didn't make a sound. That was the worst part. She didn't scream or cry or say anything. She just folded in on herself like a letter being resealed, and she covered her head with her arms, and she waited. I stood in the doorway with the hammer in my hand, and I felt something crack inside my chest, not break. Because breaking implies clean edges, but crack, the way a foundation cracks when the ground shifts beneath it. A slow splitting that you can feel spreading. I set the hammer down on the porch, slowly. I didn't throw it because throwing would make a sound. I placed it on the wooden planks and I stepped back into the kitchen without it, and I crouched down, not close to her, not within arm's reach, but close enough to speak softly, and I said, "Ruth, it's Sela's. There's no hammer. I set it outside. You're safe." She didn't move. "I'm sorry," I said. "I wasn't thinking. I should have left it outside." Still nothing. She was breathing. I could see the rise and fall of her shoulders, but the breaths were shallow and fast, the kind of breathing that belongs to prey animals, not people. I sat down on the kitchen floor, cross-legged. I made myself as small as I could, which wasn't very small because I'm 6 feet tall and built like the rancher I am. But I tried. I sat there and I looked at the wall and I waited. It took 15 minutes. I know because I counted the ticks of the clock above the stove. 912 seconds between the moment she dropped and the moment she slowly uncurled her arms and raised her head. Her face was dry, no tears. I realized I'd never seen her cry. That frightened me more than the crying would have. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't apologize. You have nothing to apologize for. I should be better by now." "Better at what?" She didn't answer. She sat on the kitchen floor with flour on her knees and her hands in her lap, and she stared at the wall behind me with an expression that was so remote, so far away, that I felt like I was looking at someone standing on the other side of a river that couldn't be crossed. "There's no schedule for this," I said. "There's no deadline." Dale said, "Dale is dead, and whatever he said, it was wrong. Whatever he told you about yourself, that you were too much, too little, too slow, too sensitive, too loud, too quiet, it was wrong. Every word. Do you hear me?" She looked at me, and for the first time since I'd known her 9 days, which felt like 9 years, I saw something move behind her eyes that wasn't fear or confusion or that compressed, clay-like blankness. It was small and it was fragile and it was gone almost immediately, but I saw it. It was the beginning of a question, the kind of question that can't be asked out loud because asking it makes you too vulnerable. Is that true? I didn't answer the question she didn't ask. I just stood up slowly and I offered her my hand again. She looked at it, she looked at me, she looked at my hand. Then she reached out and took it, and I pulled her to her feet, and her grip was light and brief, and she let go immediately afterward, but it happened. It happened, and I felt it, and she felt it, and neither of us said anything about it. She went back to kneading the dough. I went outside and put the hammer in the barn and closed the door and leaned against the wall, and pressed both palms flat against the wood and breathed. That night in my ledger I wrote, "Came inside with hammer. She dropped to the floor, covered her head, no sound. 15 minutes, she took my hand. I will never bring a tool into this house again." I underlined the last sentence, twice. The second week was marginally better, in the way that a drought is marginally better when it produces one cloud that doesn't rain. Ruth cooked, she cleaned. She organized my pantry with a precision that bordered on architectural, cans lined up by height, flour, and sugar in labeled jars, dried beans sorted into types I didn't know existed. She moved through the house like someone drawing a map, learning every corner and exit, every window that opened, and every board that creaked. I noticed that she always positioned herself near a door, that she never sat with her back to the entrance of a room, that she startled at sudden sounds but had learned to convert the startle into motion, dropping something, changing direction, picking up a task, so that it looked like ordinary clumsiness instead of terror. She was good at hiding it. She'd had years of practice. I, meanwhile, was learning to move through my own house like a man walking through a room full of sleeping birds. I learned which doors creaked and oiled them. I learned to announce myself before entering rooms, a cough, a footstep, a word. I learned to keep my voice at a constant, even volume, never sharp, never sudden. I learned to set things down gently, to close drawers slowly, to let screens swing shut on their hinges instead of banging them. My ledger entries from that period read like a field manual for living with a ghost. Each entry felt like a small victory, marked in the margins of a war I hadn't started and couldn't fight for her. On June 24th, Kayada came back, this time with Ishke. Ishke was a woman of about 45, though, like Kayada, her age seemed approximate, a suggestion rather than a fact. She was small and strong, and she had the kind of face that communicated everything through the eyes. Her English was limited but functional, and what she lacked in vocabulary, she compensated for with a directness that I had always found simultaneously terrifying and reassuring. She walked into my kitchen, set a clay pot of stew on the table, looked at Ruth and said, "You are too thin. Eat." Ruth blinked. Ishke sat down at the table and gestured to the opposite chair. "Sit." Ruth sat. I looked at Kayada. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, watching his wife with an expression that I now recognized as quiet admiration. "She's going to fix this," he said. "Fix what?" "Whatever needs fixing. Ishke doesn't ask permission." We went out to the barn and left the women alone. I was nervous about it, not because I doubted Ishke, but because Ruth hadn't been alone with a stranger since she'd arrived, and I didn't know how she'd handle it. But Kayada put a hand on my shoulder, a rare physical gesture from him, and said, "Sometimes a woman can reach a woman where a man cannot. This is not failure. This is how it works." When we came back an hour later, the clay pot was half empty and Ruth was sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that Ishke had made from herbs she'd brought in a leather pouch. Ruth's eyes were red. She'd been crying. Ishke was sitting beside her, not touching her, but close, just close. Ishke looked at me when I came in. Her eyes said very clearly, "Be patient. This will take time. She is still in there." I nodded. That night, Ruth didn't lock her bedroom door. I know because I walked past it on my way to the kitchen for water at 2 in the morning, and the door was open 1/4 of an inch, just a crack, just enough to let air and sound pass through, and I stopped in the hallway and looked at that crack of darkness, and I understood that it was the bravest thing she had done since she arrived. I went to the kitchen. I got my water. I walked back past her door without pausing, without looking, without making it a thing. In my ledger I wrote, "Door unlocked, door open 1/4 inch. She took the Whitman." Then below it, in handwriting that I barely recognized as my own, because my hand was shaking for the first time in as long as I could remember. "I don't know how to do this, but I'm going to keep. I'm going to tell you something about patience that nobody tells you. Because the people who know it don't have the words for it, and the people who have the words have never lived it. Patience is not waiting. Waiting is passive. Waiting is something you do at a train station or outside a doctor's office. Patience, real patience, the kind that breaks you open and remakes you, is active. It's choosing every single morning to set your expectations at the door like muddy boots and walk into the day barefoot and ready for whatever the floor feels like. Some days the floor is warm. Some days it's covered in broken glass. You walk in anyway. That's patience. By the 3rd week of our marriage, I had stopped expecting anything. I don't mean that I'd given up. I mean that I'd learned to take each day as its own country, with its own climate and terrain, and navigate it without maps. Some days Ruth spoke to me at meals, short sentences, observations about the weather or the garden or a passage she'd read in the Whitman book, which she was working through slowly, the way you work through a meal you want to last. Other days she barely spoke at all, and I could see the shadow behind her eyes like cloud cover, and I'd give her space the way you give space to a sky that might storm. The days had a rhythm to them that I began to rely on the way I relied on the rhythm of ranch work. Sunrise, stock check, fence repair, noon heat, afternoon chores, supper, evening quiet. Ruth wove herself into that rhythm gradually, not by inserting herself, but by finding the gaps and filling them so naturally that I only noticed she'd done it when I realized I was reaching for my coffee, and it was already poured, or that the eggs were already collected, or that the kitchen smelled like bread at 4 in the afternoon because she'd been baking while I was in the south pasture. She never asked for acknowledgement. That bothered me in a low, persistent way. She did things and then she vanished from the scene of them as if her presence might contaminate the offering. I'd find folded laundry on my bed with no trace of her. I'd find the barn swept, the chickens fed, the porch scrubbed, and she'd be in her room with the Whitman book, and the door would be open now, not wide open, but halfway, a carefully measured distance that meant I'm here, but I can still close this if I need to. I mentioned this to Kayada one afternoon when he came to use the forge. We were standing outside the barn, watching Little Hawk chase a jackrabbit through the scrub with the kind of wild, full-body joy that only 12-year-old boys and certain kinds of dogs can produce. She does everything, I said, but she won't let me see her doing it. Kayeta watched Little Hawk trip over a root, tumble, bounce up, and keep running. Does it bother you? It worries me. It's like she thinks she has to earn her place. Like if she stops being useful, I didn't finish the sentence. Send her away. Or worse. Kayeta was quiet for a while. Then he said, when the soldiers moved my people to the reservation at Bosque Redondo, this was before I was born, but my mother told me the women worked without stopping. Not because they wanted to, because stopping meant being noticed, and being noticed was not safe. They made themselves necessary so they could not be discarded. It is the logic of a person who has been told through action that they exist only to serve. I looked at him. How did they stop? Some didn't. Some carried it their whole lives like a stone they couldn't set down because their arms had molded around it. Others, he paused, others had someone who saw them. Not what they did, them, and they were allowed to be seen without consequence, and slowly over time they began to believe that their presence alone was enough. How long did that take? I don't know, my mother never told me that part. He looked at me sideways. Maybe she was still figuring it out herself. On July 12th, I came home from the south pasture and found Ruth sitting on the porch. Not working, not reading, just sitting in the rocking chair with her hands in her lap, looking out at the land. The sun was low and the light was that amber color that the territory gets in July when the heat has been cooking the earth all day and the sky seems to breathe it back out in gold. I climbed the porch steps and sat down in the other chair, the one I'd built the previous winter from leftover cedar, with a slightly wonky armrest that I kept meaning to fix and never did. It's beautiful here, she said. I looked at the land, scrubland and pinyon and sky, the same view I'd been looking at for 6 years. I'd stopped seeing it. Or rather, I'd reduced it to entries in my ledger, precipitation totals, pasture conditions, fence line assessments. I'd turned beauty into data because data was manageable and beauty was not. It is, I said. Dale never let me sit outside. He said it was idle. I didn't respond immediately. I was learning that when she mentioned Dale, the best thing I could do was be still. Not silent. Silence could feel like disapproval, but still. Present, like a rock in a stream that the water can move around. Sitting isn't idle, I said. It's how you figure out what you think. What do you think about when you sit here? I considered the question. Fence posts mostly, whether I have enough hay for winter, if the creek will hold through August. I paused. Sometimes I think about whether I'm doing this right. Doing what right? Being a person. It seems like it should come with instructions, and it doesn't. She looked at me and something happened at the corner of her mouth, a small movement, not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. The foundation, the blueprint, as if her face was considering the possibility and hadn't quite committed. You're the strangest man I've ever met, she said. Thank you. It wasn't entirely a compliment. I'll take what I can get. That near smile again. Then she looked away, back at the land, and we sat on the porch in the amber light and didn't talk for another 20 minutes. But it was a different kind of quiet than the first week quiet. That had been the quiet of two strangers locked in mutual uncertainty. This was the quiet of two people sitting in the same direction. I wrote it down that night. July 12, she sat on the porch, no book, no task, just sat, called me strange, almost smiled. The trouble came on July 19th, and it came in the form of a man named Garrett Poe. Garrett Poe was a cattleman from the Pecos Valley who owned 3 times the land I did and possessed the moral character of a fence post, which I considered an insult to fence posts. He was big, loud, red-faced from whiskey, and he had a voice that carried across a room like a thrown chair. He'd been trying to buy my south pasture for 2 years because it bordered his property, and he wanted the water rights to the creek that ran through it. And I'd refused him every time because I didn't like him, and because my creek was none of his business. He rode up to my property around noon with 2 of his hands, and sat on his horse in my yard and shouted my name. I came out of the barn. Ruth was in the garden, 30 feet from the house, on her knees in the tomato rows. I saw her head come up at the sound of Garrett's voice, and I saw her shoulders tighten, and I felt something in my chest go very still and very focused. Drummond, Garrett said, we need to talk. We don't. I'm making you another offer on the south pasture. $65, that's more than fair. It's not for sale. Everything's for sale, Silas. You just haven't found your price. Found it, it's you leaving my property. Garrett's face darkened. He was a man who was used to getting what he wanted, and he processed refusal the way a boiler processes too much steam pressure building with nowhere to go. You're making a mistake, he said. That creek's going to dry up in 10 years, and you'll have nothing to show for it. Then I'll have nothing to show for it on my own land. Thank you for coming, goodbye. He sat there on his horse, not moving. His two hands shifted uncomfortably. I could feel the moment teetering. Garrett wasn't violent, usually, but he was unpredictable when angry, and I had a rusted Colt revolver in the barn that I hadn't fired in 8 months, and Ruth was in the garden. And if this went sideways, she was between the house and 3 men on horseback, and I should have thought about this. I should have had a plan. I kept a ledger of every nail and post on this ranch, but I didn't have a plan for this. Then Garrett's eyes moved past me and landed on Ruth. She'd stood up from the garden. She was holding a trowel and her dress was dirty at the knees, and she was standing very still, that dear stillness that I knew so well by now, and Garrett looked at her the way men like Garrett look at things, as objects to be assessed, priced, and acquired or dismissed. That your new wife, he said. Heard you got married, seems like a mousy little thing. I felt something move in my blood, something old and hot and completely unfamiliar because I was Silas Drummond and I didn't do anger. I did ledgers, I did numbers, I did rational assessment and measured response. But that word, mousy, applied to a woman who had survived 4 years of a man like Dale Calloway and had the courage to start over and was standing in my garden with dirt on her knees, because she'd been tending to plants that she'd planted with her own hands. That word was a match on dry grass, and I felt the fire catch. Get off my land, I said. My voice was quiet. I heard it as if from a distance. It was very quiet and very steady, and I heard Garrett hear it too because his expression changed. Not quite fear, but recognition. The recognition that a man who speaks quietly in anger is more dangerous than a man who shouts. $65, Silas, last offer. Garrett, get off my land. Now, don't come back. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he pulled his reins, turned his horse, and rode out with his hands behind him. I watched them go until the dust settled. When I turned around, Ruth was still standing in the garden, still holding the trowel, but she was looking at me differently than she'd ever looked at me before. Not with fear, not with that compressed blankness, with something I couldn't name, something I'd have to turn over in my mind for weeks before I understood it was wonder. He wanted your land, she said. He wants my water rights. He's been pestering me for 2 years. You didn't yell. No. You were angry. Yes. But you didn't yell. I realized, standing there in the July sun with the dust from Garrett's departure still settling around us, that she was seeing something for the first time. That it was possible for a man to be angry, genuinely, deeply angry, and to not raise his voice, to not raise his hand, to not fill a room with his rage and make everyone in it smaller. Ruth, I said, I'm not going to yell at you, not today, not tomorrow, not ever. That's not who I am. Dale used to say that too. The sentence hit me like cold water. She said it without malice, without accusation. She said it the way you state a fact. The sky is blue, the creek runs east, men say things that aren't true. I know, I said, and I know that my saying it doesn't prove anything. Only time proves it. So I'm going to keep not yelling, and eventually the time will add up, and either you'll believe it or you won't. But I'll keep doing it regardless. She looked at the trowel in her hand. She looked at the garden. She looked at me. I want to believe it, she said, so quiet I almost missed it. I want to. That's enough. For now, that's enough. She went back to her tomatoes. I went back to the barn. I opened my ledger and I stared at the blank page for a long time, and what I wanted to write was something about what it felt like to stand in the gap between what you say and what someone's experience has taught them never to trust, and I couldn't find the words for that, so I wrote. July 19. Garrett Poe came, wanted South Pasture, refused. He looked at Ruth wrong. I was angry, didn't yell. She noticed. On July 27th, Ishke invited Ruth to come see her garden. This was, I understood from Kayeta, a significant gesture. Ishke's garden was not just a garden. It was a legacy, plants and seeds passed down through her family for generations, corn and squash and beans grown in the old way, interplanted in the mounds that her grandmother had taught her to build. For Ishke to invite someone to see it was to invite them into her history. I drove Ruth out in the wagon. She sat beside me and held the squash she was bringing as a gift, grown from the seeds of the squash that Ishke had originally given us. And she asked me questions about Keita and Ishke that I answered as honestly as I could. How long have they been here? As long as I have, maybe longer. The government moved his people around a lot, from the reservation at Bosque Redondo to Mescalero. Keita and Ishke settled on that piece of land about 8 years ago. It's not officially theirs. The government doesn't recognize it. But they're there, and nobody's come to move them, and Keita doesn't talk about what would happen if someone did. That's not fair. No. Do people bother them? Some do. Newcomb refuses to sell to them at the store. The Dawsons are decent but careful they won't socialize openly. Garrett Poe, I stopped myself. What about Garrett Poe? He's tried to run them off twice. Says their land is in his grazing corridor. Keita handled it. How? He was still there the next morning, and the next after that. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply not leave. Ruth was quiet after that. She held the squash in her lap and looked out at the territory, and I could see her thinking, not the fearful, trapped thinking I'd seen in the first weeks, but something broader. Something that was reaching past her own walls to take in the shape of other people's struggles. Ishke's homestead was small and orderly. A one-room adobe house with a brush ramada for shade. A corral holding 4 horses, and the garden, which spread across a quarter-acre of land that Ishke had terraced with rocks carried from the creek bed. It was one of the most impressive pieces of agricultural work I'd ever seen, and I told Ishke so every time I visited, and every time she responded with the same look, which translated roughly to, "Of course it is." Ishke met Ruth at the edge of the garden. She took the squash, examined each one with a seriousness that suggested she was evaluating Ruth's character through the quality of her produce, and apparently found them satisfactory because she nodded and said, "Good, come." They walked into the garden together. I stayed back with Keita, who was mending a bridle beneath the ramada. Little Hawk was somewhere on the hillside with a bow, hunting rabbits or lizards or imaginary enemies. "She seems different," Keita said, not looking up from the bridle. "She's trying." "No. Different from when she arrived." He pulled a leather strap through a buckle. "She looks at things now. Before, she was only looking for exits." I watched Ruth follow Ishke through the rows. Ishke was talking and gesturing, explaining the planting method, the seed selection, the watering schedule. Ruth was listening with her whole body, leaning in, nodding not in her old precise way, but with real engagement, real interest. Then Ishke did something I didn't expect. She knelt beside a row of corn, dug her hands into the earth, and pulled up a small root cluster. She held it out to Ruth, not as a gift, but as an instruction. "Here, feel this, understand this." Ruth knelt beside her. She took the roots in her hands. Ishke showed her how to feel for the moisture in the soil, how to tell by touch whether the earth was ready for planting. Ruth's fingers sank into the dirt, and I watched her face change. Not a big change, not a transformation, just a softening the way clay softens when it gets wet. The compressed, dense quality of her expression loosened slightly, and underneath it was something raw and open, like new skin under a scab. Ishke saw it too. She put a hand on Ruth's arm, briefly, lightly, the way you touch a bird that's landed on your fence and might fly away. And Ruth didn't flinch. She didn't pull back. She looked at Ishke's hand on her arm, and she let it stay there, and the two of them knelt in the garden in the afternoon light with their hands in the earth, and I felt something in my throat that I couldn't swallow down. Keita was watching me. "You feel it," he said. "Feel what?" "When she lets someone in, even a little, it moves through you." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. You're a man who writes everything down because you're afraid of feelings that don't fit in columns, and this doesn't fit in any column you have." I looked at him. He looked back at me with that internal amusement, the stove-processed kind, warm but invisible. "You're very annoying," I said. My grandmother said the same thing. On the ride home, Ruth held a small bundle that Ishke had given her, seeds, wrapped in cloth, with instructions in Ishke's broken English about when to plant and how deep and what songs to sing to them. Ruth held this bundle as if it were a living thing. "She lost people," Ruth said halfway home. "Ishke, She told me not details, just that she lost people when she was young. Family, she said, the earth remembers what we put in it. Seeds and grief both grow. I drove the wagon and didn't say anything. She said the garden saved her. That putting things in the ground and watching them come up was the only thing that made her believe the world wasn't just taking. That sometimes it gave back. Ishke is a wise woman. She asked me about Dale. I gripped the reins tighter. You don't have to talk about that. No, I want to tell you, she asked, and I told her, not everything, but some of it. The first time he hit me, it was 3 weeks after we were married. I burned a pan of cornbread and he broke my wrist. Her voice was flat, informational, as if she were reading from a document. He told everyone I fell, and I agreed with him. I agreed because I was 19 years old and I didn't have anywhere to go and he was my husband, and I thought, she stopped. I thought it was my fault. For a long time, I thought it was my fault. It wasn't. I know, Ishke said the same thing. She said, a man who hurts a woman does not hurt her because of what she did. He hurts her because of what he is. She said it very simply, like it was obvious, and I sat there in the dirt with seeds in my hands and I thought, why did it take me 7 years to hear something that obvious? I had no answer for that. There are questions that don't have answers, only echoes. She held my hand, Ruth said. While I talked, she just held it. She didn't tell me it was going to be okay. She didn't try to fix it. She just held my hand and listened, and when I was done, she gave me seeds and told me to plant them. I drove the wagon in silence for a while. Then I said, that sounds like Ishke. Silas. Yes. Why are you kind to me? The question was so simple and so enormous that I almost drove the wagon off the trail. I pulled the horses up and sat there with the reins in my hands, and the sun going down behind the mesa, and the sky turning that deep, bruised purple that the territory gets at dusk, when the light looks like something that's been hurt and is healing. Because you're a person, I said, and persons deserve kindness. That's not a reason. Most men aren't kind just because someone's a person. Then most men are wrong. But why specifically me? You didn't know me, you still barely know me. You married a stranger and gave her a room with a lock on the door and bought her books, and you've never once, not once, asked me for anything. Why? I looked at the horses. I looked at my hands on the reins. I looked at the land stretching out in front of us, dark and getting darker, and I thought about my ledger and all the things I'd recorded in it, rainfall and fence posts and calf weights and every small gesture she'd made toward the light. And I thought about how none of it captured the truth, which was that I did not know why. I didn't have a noble reason. I didn't have a calculated motive. I had only the simple, stubborn conviction that this was the right thing to do, and I was doing it, and the doing of it was enough. I don't have a good answer, I said. I wish I did. I wish I could open my ledger and show you a column that says reasons for kindness with neat entries and running totals. But I can't. I'm just a man who keeps track of things, and the only thing I can tell you is that since you came here, the things I'm keeping track of have changed. Before I counted fence posts and hay bales. Now I count the days you leave your door open. And both of those feel equally important, and I don't know what that means, but I'm not going to stop. She was quiet for a long time. The horses waited patient. Somewhere in the scrub, a nightjar called, and another one answered, and the sound moved through the dusk like a thread being pulled through fabric. You should start the wagon, Ruth said finally. Why? Because if we stay here much longer, I might say something I'm not ready to say. I started the wagon. We rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence, not absence, not avoidance. Promise. The next morning I came into the kitchen and found a piece of paper on the table, folded once. Ruth's handwriting, small, precise, steady. It said, you asked me what I'd like to do. I'd like to stay. That was all, no signature, no explanation, just those 2 sentences. I folded the paper back up. I put it in my ledger between the pages for July 27th and July 28th. I closed the book. I made coffee. When she came into the kitchen, I handed her a cup. She took it. Our fingers touched briefly on the handle. Neither of us pulled away. July 28, she would like to stay. August came in like a furnace. The heat was the kind that makes the air visible, rising in waves off the dirt so that the land itself looked like it was breathing, slow and heavy. I cut back on afternoon work and spent the hottest hours in the barn, repairing tack and sharpening tools where the shade kept the temperature almost tolerable. Ruth had planted Ishke's seeds. A small patch near the east side of the house, where the morning sun hit first and the afternoon shade came earliest. She watered them at dawn and dusk, carrying the bucket from the well with both hands, and I watched her from the barn doorway without watching, that peripheral attention I'd developed, keeping track of her the way you keep track of weather, not staring but always aware. She talked to the seeds. I heard her when the wind was right. Not coherent sentences, mostly, just murmurs, encouragement, small sounds that weren't quite words. It reminded me of something my mother used to do, singing to the chickens in the morning, not for the chickens, but for herself. A way of being present in a body that felt safe enough to make unnecessary sound. On August 4th, the first shoots broke through. Ruth came running, actually running, a word I'm using intentionally because I had never seen her move faster than a deliberate walk, to the barn where I was oiling a saddle, and she stood in the doorway breathing hard and said, "They're coming up." Her face was different. I keep saying that different, changed, shifted, because I don't have better words for what was happening to her. The density was loosening. The clay was becoming earth. She looked like someone who had been holding her breath for 7 years and was slowly, carefully, experimentally discovering that she could exhale. "Show me," I said. She led me to the garden. 4 green shoots, thin as threads, pushing up through the brown dirt. She knelt beside them and touched the soil near the base of one, not the shoot itself, as if it were too fragile for even the lightest contact. "Ishke said the first one to break through is the bravest," she said. "She said it's the one that tells the others it's safe to come up." I knelt beside her. We looked at the shoots. 4 threads of green in a sea of brown. It shouldn't have meant anything. It was agriculture. I had crops, I had gardens, I'd watched 1,000 things grow. But I looked at Ruth's face and I saw her seeing something more than plants. She was seeing proof. Proof that you could put something fragile in the ground and it would grow, that the ground was not just a place where things got buried, that buried things could rise. "The first one's always the bravest," I said. She looked at me and she smiled, not the almost smile, not the foundation or the blueprint. A real smile, small and uncertain and imperfect, like a green shoot pushing through brown dirt, fragile and brave and absolutely. I've gone back to the entry for August 4th in my ledger more times than I can count, and every time I read it, I noticed the handwriting. It's different from every other entry I've ever made. Looser, less controlled. The letters lean forward slightly, as if they're in a hurry to get somewhere, and the words themselves are simpler than my usual precise, clipped style. August 4, seeds came up, she smiled, the real kind. Below that, in smaller writing, squeezed into the margin. I don't know when it happened, but something in this house has changed. Not just her, me. I'm keeping track of different things now, not just what I have. What I could lose. I remember writing that. I remember the feeling new and uncomfortable, like wearing a shirt that doesn't fit yet but might, with time, soften to the shape of you. I'd spent 6 years arranging my life into a structure so orderly that nothing could surprise me. Ledgers and schedules and fence lines drawn straight across the land like sentences in a paragraph that says, "This is mine, this is measured, this is under control." And now there was Ruth, and Ruth did not fit in any structure I'd built. And the strange thing, the thing I hadn't expected, was that I didn't want her to. But August was not finished with us. On August 11th, 2 things happened that converged into a crisis neither of us saw coming. The first thing was rain. Not the gradual, reasonable rain that the territory sometimes produced in late summer, the kind that fills the creek and greens the scrub and makes the ledger entries satisfyingly positive. This was a violent, sudden thunderstorm that rolled in from the west at midday and turned the sky from blue to black in 20 minutes. I'd seen storms like it before. They came fast, they dumped water, they flooded the low ground, and they left as suddenly as they arrived, leaving behind a landscape rearranged by force. I was in the south pasture when it hit. I'd been checking the fence line, Garrett Poe's cattle had been pushing against the boundary again, and I wanted to make sure the posts were solid. The storm came up behind me like an animal, and by the time I turned my horse toward home, I was already soaked, and the creek was rising. The second thing happened while I was gone. Ruth told me about it that evening, after the storm had passed and the creek had crested and retreated, and the damage was being assessed. She told it flatly, in that informational voice she used when she was describing something that had cost her too much to feel in the moment and would have to be felt later, at a safer time, in smaller portions. A man had come to the ranch, not Garrett Poe, a man named Carl Calloway, Dale's brother. He'd ridden up to the house during the storm, and Ruth had opened the door because she thought it was me, because who else would be out in that weather? And when she saw Carl standing on the porch with water pouring off his hat and Dale's face looking back at her from Dale's brother's bones, she had tried to close the door and he had put his boot in it. He hadn't hurt her. She made that clear, and I could see in the way she said it that she needed me to hear it before the details came, as if the details without that reassurance would be too much for me to hold steady against. He hadn't touched her. But he had stood in my kitchen, where she made coffee in the morning and baked bread in the afternoon, and where we sat across from each other at a table that was slowly becoming ours instead of mine. And he had told her that she owed the Calloway family. That Dale's death was her doing. That she had no right to a new life while Dale's mother was grieving. That she should come back to Las Cruces and face what she'd done. "What did you say?" I asked. We were sitting on the porch. The storm was gone, the sky clearing in the east, the light that particular rain-washed gold that makes everything look newer than it is. Ruth had her hands around a cup of tea, Ishke's herbs, which she brewed every evening now, and she was looking at the puddles in the yard with that far-off expression that used to frighten me, but which I now recognized as her way of processing things too large to face directly. I told him to leave. He left. Not at first. He said some things about me, about what kind of wife I'd been, about how Dale told his family I was. She stopped. She took a breath. He said I was cold, ungrateful, that I drove Dale to drink, that everything he did was because I... Ruth, I know it's not true, I know. Do you? She looked at me, the clay-brown eyes, but not clay anymore, something warmer, something with more movement in it, like river water in sun. I'm learning to know it. It's different from knowing it in my head. My head has known it for a long time. The rest of me is still catching up. What happened then? He grabbed my arm, here. She touched her left forearm just above the wrist Dale had broken 7 years ago, and I felt that cracking sensation in my chest again, that foundation shifting. Not hard, just to hold me still, to make me listen, and I... She paused, she set the tea down on the porch rail. She turned her forearm over and looked at it as if reading something written there. I pulled away, she said. I pulled my arm away from him and I said, "You do not get to touch me, not you, not anyone, not unless I say so." And I said it loud, Silas. I said it so loud that my own voice scared me. I sat in my chair and I looked at her and I felt something I'd never felt before. Not the cracking, not the worry, not the patient ache of watching someone heal in increments so small they barely registered. This was different. This was a feeling that filled my chest like the storm had filled the creek, sudden and powerful, and beyond any measurement I had. It was pride, not the small, selfish kind. The kind that comes from watching someone stand up inside their own body and claim it as their own. What did he do? He stared at me, he looked surprised, like he didn't expect that. Like I was supposed to be the person Dale told him I was, and I wasn't, and he didn't know what to do with that. Then he left. He walked out the door and got on his horse and rode away. And I stood in the kitchen and my hands were shaking and my heart it was going so fast I thought it might come out of my chest. And I locked the door. And then I unlocked it. And then I locked it again. And then I unlocked it and left it unlocked because I decided I'm done locking doors because of men named Calloway. I sat there on the porch in the rain-washed light, and I wanted to say something adequate to what she just told me, something that matched the size of it. But I am a man who keeps a ledger and counts fence posts, and my entire vocabulary for the things that matter most consists of short, plain, insufficient words. "I'm proud of you," I said. She picked up her tea. She drank it. She said, "I'm proud of me too." I think that might be the first time I've ever said that. The aftermath of Carl Calloway's visit was complicated. Not because he came back, he didn't. And I later learned from Pastor Whitfield that he'd ridden straight to Las Cruces, and told the Calloway family that Ruth was living with a rancher who looked like he'd kill anyone who came near her, which was an interesting characterization of a man who kept a ledger, and had once gotten emotional about a calf. But because the visit had stirred something in Ruth that couldn't be unstirred. She didn't retreat. I'd feared she would, that the encounter would push her back behind the walls she'd been slowly dismantling. But instead, something opposite happened. She got louder. Not loud, Ruth would never be loud, but present in a way she hadn't been before. She started sitting in the main room instead of her bedroom in the evenings. She started talking at meals, not just answering my observations, but initiating them. She had opinions about the garden, about the chickens, about whether the south fence needed reinforcing or replacing entirely. She disagreed with me about the chickens. She thought the coop needed rebuilding. I thought it was fine. And she stated her disagreement plainly, without apology, without hedging. And I realized with a start that I had never heard her disagree with anyone about anything. I rebuilt the chicken coop, not because she was right, but that wasn't the point. The point was that she felt safe enough to say so. She also started going to Ishke's on her own. I'd come home from the pasture and find a note on the table, "Gone to Ishke's, back by supper." And the first time I found one, I stood in the kitchen and held the scrap of paper and felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't known was tight. She was going somewhere, by choice, alone, without asking permission, without fear. Ishke and Ruth developed something that I could only observe from the outside, a connection that operated in a language I didn't speak, built on shared understanding of things I could acknowledge but never fully comprehend. They gardened together. They cooked together. Ishke taught Ruth how to make bread in the Apache way, baked on hot stones, and Ruth taught Ishke the Whitman poetry she'd been reading, translating the images into simpler words that Ishke could hold and turn over. I came to Ishke's one afternoon to pick Ruth up and found them sitting under the ramada, Ruth reading aloud while Ishke braided horsehair into rope, and Little Hawk was sitting nearby pretending not to listen but clearly listening. And the scene was so ordinary and so extraordinary at the same time that I stopped at the edge of the property and just watched for a while before anyone noticed me. Kayata noticed me first because Kayata noticed everything. He was at the corral, brushing one of his horses, and he looked at me standing there at the edge of his land with my hat in my hand, watching my wife read poetry to his wife under a brush ramada, while his grandson braided a piece of leather, and a horse swished flies in the heat. And Kayata said the most Kayata thing he'd ever said to me. "You don't have to stand at the edge, Silas. You're allowed to walk in." I walked in. Ruth looked up and saw me and didn't flinch, didn't tense, didn't brace. She said, "Listen to this." And she read me 4 lines of Whitman that I don't remember because I wasn't listening to the words. I was listening to her voice. It had changed. Like everything else about her, it had changed so gradually that the change was only visible in retrospect. It was fuller. It occupied more space. It wasn't compressed anymore, it breathed. September came and the heat broke and the garden produced its harvest. Squash and beans and corn, Ishke's seeds, grown in Ruth's soil, tended by Ruth's hands. The yields were modest, barely worth recording in the ledger, but Ruth insisted on counting every single squash and bean and ear of corn, and she brought them inside and laid them out on the kitchen table, and stood there looking at them with an expression that I can only describe as maternal. The look of someone regarding something they made from nothing, from seed and dirt and persistence, from an act of faith in a process they couldn't fully control. 17 squash, she said, 42 ears of corn. Too many beans to count. I can count them. I know you can, that's why I'm not letting you. I laughed. It was a startled, ungainly sound because I hadn't laughed I actually couldn't remember the last time I'd laughed. I'd been so focused on being careful, being gentle, being quiet, being safe, that I'd forgotten that laughter was something a person could produce. And Ruth looked at me when I laughed, and she laughed too, and her laugh was rusty and unused, and beautiful the way a piece of old machinery is beautiful when it starts working again after years of disuse. You can hear the effort in it, the parts that are still stiff, but underneath the stiffness is something whole. We stood in the kitchen laughing about vegetables, and it wasn't funny, not really, but it didn't need to be funny. It needed to be free, and it was. That night, Ruth came into the main room after supper and sat in the chair near the lamp, not her usual chair, which was by the door, but the other one, the one deeper in the room, further from the exit. She had the Whitman book open in her lap, but she wasn't reading it. She was looking at me. "What?" I said. I was writing in my ledger. I still wrote in it every night. The ritual hadn't changed, even though the content had transformed from livestock inventories into something I didn't have a name for. A diary? A testimony? Evidence? I didn't know. "You write in that book every night," she said. "I do. What do you write?" I looked at the ledger. I looked at her. I thought about all the entries, the rain totals and the fence posts and the calf counts, and then the other entries, the ones that had started on June 9th and hadn't stopped. She flinched. She locked the door. She almost smiled. She said she wants to stay. She smiled. She didn't flinch. She left the door open. She stood up. She spoke her name. "Everything," I said. Can I read it? The question was quiet, but I understood its weight. She was asking for access to the place where I kept my truth, the place that was mine the way her locked bedroom had been hers. She was asking me to unlock a door. I closed the ledger. I held it for a moment, then I handed it to her. She took it. She opened it to the first page, January 1st, 1882, and she began to read. I sat in my chair and watched her read my life, the whole documented year of it, the fence posts and the weather and the calves, and then June 9th. And I watched her face change as she moved from the ledger of a lonely rancher into the ledger of a man who was learning, entry by entry, how to pay attention to something other than survival. She read for a long time. I don't know how long. The lamp burned low and I refilled it once and she didn't look up. She turned pages slowly, carefully, running her finger under certain lines, pausing at certain entries, pressing her palm flat against certain pages as if she could feel the words through her skin. When she reached the most recent entry, September's tally, the vegetables, the count she hadn't let me make, she closed the book. She held it against her chest with both arms. She looked at me across the room, across the quiet space between two chairs that had once held a saddle blanket and a stranger, and she said, "You counted the days I left my door open." "Yes." "You counted the days I didn't flinch." "Yes." "You wrote about me the way you write about rain, like I was something natural, something that just happened." "You did just happen. You showed up and you were here and I started recording you the same way I record everything because that's how I make sense of the world. But the records changed. You changed them. The ledger used to be about what I had. Now it's about..." I stopped. I didn't know how to finish the sentence. I've been able to write things in the ledger that I couldn't say out loud, because writing is a private act, a conversation between a pen and a page, and speaking is an act of courage that requires you to release words into a space where someone else can hear them and you can't take them back. "About what?" she said. "About what matters." She was quiet. Then she stood up from the chair deep in the room, far from the door, and she walked across the space between us, and she set the ledger down on the table beside my chair, and she stood there, close enough that I could see the lamp reflected in her eyes. "Silas?" "Yes." "I'd like you to hold my hand." I looked at her hand. She was holding it out, the way I had held mine out that first day at the wagon when she'd flinched and I'd stepped back. But she wasn't flinching now. She was offering. Her hand was steady, not the controlled steadiness of someone trained to suppress trembling, but the genuine steadiness of someone who has decided. I took her hand. Her fingers closed around mine, warm and real and present. She held on and I held on, and we stood there in the lamplight in a kitchen that smelled like bread and squash and coffee, in a house that had once held one lonely man and his ledger, and now held something else entirely, something I still couldn't measure, something that existed in the spaces between entries, in the margins, in the unwritten. She sat down on the arm of my chair. I didn't move. She leaned against my shoulder, slightly, the weight of her barely there, like a bird landing on a fence post and deciding to stay. "Tell me about tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow I need to check the north fence, and there's a heifer that's been favoring her left front leg, and I think your squash patch needs mulching before the cold comes." "What else?" "I'll write in the ledger." "What will you write?" I thought about it. I thought about all the things I'd been recording, the slow, meticulous documentation of a woman putting herself back together, piece by piece, day by day, like a house being rebuilt from the foundation up, each beam and board and nail placed with terrible care by someone who knew exactly how it felt when a house fell down. "I don't know yet," I said. "I'll know when it happens." "That's not very organized of you." "I know you're ruining my system." "Good." We sat there. The lamp burned. Outside, the September night was cool and clear, and the stars were doing whatever stars do when no one's measuring them, and the creek was running at its normal level, and the fence posts were standing or not standing, and none of it was in the ledger yet, and that was fine. That was better than fine. I want to tell you how the story ends. I want to write a final entry, a summation, a closing line that wraps everything up in the clean, precise handwriting of a man who keeps track of things. But I can't, because it didn't end. That's the thing about the stories people tell, about wounded people and gentle people, and the slow, agonizing, sacred work of learning to trust again. They want an ending, a last page. A moment where the music swells and the credits roll and everyone is healed and everything is fine. But Ruth wasn't healed on September 14th when she held my hand. She wasn't healed on October 2nd when she woke from a nightmare and came to my door instead of locking hers and stood there in the dark and said, "Can I just be here? I don't need anything. I just need to not be alone." She wasn't healed on October 19th when she flinched at the sound of a horse approaching and then caught herself, and I saw the frustration in her face, the anger at her own fear, which was its own kind of progress, because anger at fear is what happens when you've stopped accepting fear as normal. She wasn't healed, she was healing, present tense, ongoing, a process without a completion date, without a final entry, without a ledger line that reads finished. And I was changing too, though I understood it less and talked about it even less than that. The man who had lived alone for 6 years and spoken to another human being about fence wire was becoming someone else. Someone who noticed things that couldn't be measured, who valued things that couldn't be counted, who was learning, slowly and clumsily, that the most important entries in a ledger are the ones you can't write down. Keita said something to me in late October that I've turned over in my mind many times since. We were standing at the fence line between my property and the open range, watching the season change, and he said, "You think you saved her." "I don't think that." "You do, a little. And it's making you careful in the wrong way. You're being gentle with her the way a man is gentle with something broken. But she isn't broken, Silas, she was bent. And she's straightening, and the thing about straightening is that it requires resistance. She doesn't need you to protect her from every sharp edge. She needs you to be the wall she can push against to find out how strong she is." That sounds risky. Everything that matters is risky. You know this. You're a rancher. You put seeds in the ground every spring knowing the drought might take them. You do it anyway, because the alternative is empty ground, and empty ground is the saddest thing there is. I thought about Ruth's garden, the 17 squash, the 42 ears of corn, the too many to count beans, seeds put in the ground by a woman who had been told by word and by fist that nothing she planted would ever grow. "She's stronger than she thinks," I said. "She's stronger than you think," Keita corrected. "That's different." The last entry in my ledger for 1882, dated December 31st, reads differently from any entry before it. The handwriting is steady but looser than January's. The handwriting of a man who has learned that looseness is not the same as carelessness. The entry is short. Year-end summary. Cattle 34 head up from 29. Calves born 8, lost to weather 2 fence line 94% repaired, creek held through summer. Garden yield sufficient, roof repaired, chicken coop rebuilt, Ruth was right. New additions, 1 wife. 1 friendship deepened, Keita Ishke Little Hawk. 1 woman's garden planted from gifted seeds, an unknown number of locked doors unlocked, an unknown number of flinches not flinched. Things I cannot measure, the weight of someone leaning against your shoulder because they choose to, the sound of laughter coming back to a room that forgot it, the moment between a flinch and the decision not to. Starting balance, January 1st, 1882. 1 man, 1 ledger, 160 acres of scrubland. Closing balance, December 31st, 1882, all of the above, and more than I have. The entry stops there. The sentence is unfinished. I know because I'm looking at it right now, years later, and the pen trail just ends. A small dot of ink where the nib rested, and then nothing. I remember why I stopped. I remember sitting at the table on New Year's Eve with the lamp burning and the last log in the stove and Ruth asleep in the next room. Her door open all the way now. All the way, no crack, no hesitation, just open. And I remember that I couldn't finish the sentence because finishing it would mean defining it. And defining it would mean limiting it. And I had spent the entire year learning that the most important things resist definition the way water resists being held. I set the pen down. I closed the ledger. I put it on the shelf. And then I did something I'd never done in the 6 years I'd lived in that house. I went to the porch and I sat in the cedar chair with the wonky armrest, and I looked at the land, the scrubland and the piñon and the sky full of winter stars, and I didn't count anything. I didn't measure anything. I didn't write anything down. I just sat there in the cold, in the dark, in the silence, and I let the year exist without recording it.